The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Margaret Collins heard the screams cutting through the howling wind. Standing at the frosted window of her new husband's cabin in the Colorado Territory, she could barely make out the dark shapes stumbling through the snow toward their remote homestead. 9 desperate souls, half frozen and barely alive, collapsed at her doorstep just as the town council's final words echoed in her mind. "Leave them to die. They're not our responsibility." What happened next would shatter every assumption about the quiet mail-order bride from Boston and transform her into the most unlikely hero in the unforgiving wilderness of 1887 Colorado. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell had never imagined her life would lead to this moment, standing on the train platform in Denver with nothing but a worn leather suitcase and a letter from a stranger promising marriage. The December wind cut through her thin wool coat as she searched the crowd for the face that would determine her future. At 24, she was considered past prime marriageable age in Boston society, a fact her stepmother had reminded her of daily since her father's death 6 months earlier. Margaret Hartwell. The voice belonged to a tall, weathered man in his 40s, with kind eyes and hands that spoke of years of hard labor. Thomas Collins removed his hat respectfully, revealing prematurely gray hair that matched the Colorado sky. "I'm Thomas. Welcome to Colorado Territory." The journey to their homestead took them through terrain that seemed carved from another world entirely. Rolling plains gave way to foothills, then to mountains that scraped the belly of storm clouds gathering overhead. Thomas drove the wagon with practiced ease, pointing out landmarks and explaining the challenges of frontier life with an honesty that both frightened and impressed Margaret. "The nearest neighbor is 8 miles east," he said as they navigated a particularly treacherous mountain pass. "The town of Cedar Ridge is 12 miles south, but in winter that might as well be 100. You'll need to be prepared for months of isolation." Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching the landscape grow increasingly desolate. She'd answered Thomas's advertisement in the Boston Herald out of desperation rather than romance. With her father's debts consuming the family estate and her stepmother eager to remarry without the burden of an unmarried stepdaughter, Margaret had faced a choice between accepting charity from distant relatives or taking a chance on frontier marriage. The advertisement had been straightforward. Honest rancher seeking educated wife for companionship and partnership in Colorado Territory, must be willing to work hard and endure frontier hardships. Character more important than beauty, Margaret had written a careful response, emphasizing her education, her experience managing her father's household after her mother's death, and her willingness to adapt to frontier life. Their correspondence over 4 months had revealed Thomas to be a thoughtful, principled man who'd lost his first wife to influenza 3 years earlier. He owned 160 acres of grazing land, a modest cabin, and a small herd of cattle that provided a basic living. He wasn't wealthy, but he was stable, honest, and desperately lonely in a way that resonated with Margaret's own isolation in Boston society. "There it is," Thomas said, as they crested a ridge and his homestead came into view. The cabin was larger than Margaret had expected, built from hewn logs, with a stone chimney that promised warmth against the harsh mountain winters. A barn and several outbuildings suggested a working ranch operation, while split-rail fencing marked pastures where cattle huddled against the approaching storm. The cabin's interior surprised Margaret with its cleanliness and organization. Thomas had clearly prepared for her arrival, with fresh linens on the bed, supplies stocked in the pantry, and books arranged on shelves built into the walls. A wedding dress hung from a peg near the fireplace, simple but elegant, made from fabric that must have cost Thomas a significant portion of his savings. "I had Mrs. Patterson in town make it," Thomas explained, noticing Margaret's attention to the dress. "She guessed at your measurements from the photograph you sent. We can have the ceremony tomorrow if you're willing. or wait until you've had time to settle in and decide if you want to go through with the arrangement. The offer to delay their marriage revealed the essential decency that had drawn Margaret to Thomas's letters. He was giving her an opportunity to change her mind, even though backing out now would leave her stranded with no resources and no way back to Boston. "Tomorrow is fine," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I didn't come this far to have second thoughts." Their wedding took place the next morning in the small church at Cedar Ridge, witnessed by a handful of townspeople who'd gathered more out of curiosity than celebration. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with the efficiency of someone accustomed to marrying practical strangers on the frontier, where companionship often mattered more than passion in determining marital success. Margaret wore the dress Thomas had commissioned, which fit better than she'd expected and made her feel, for the first time in months, like something other than a burden to be disposed of. Thomas wore his best suit, clearly uncomfortable, with the formality but determined to mark the occasion with appropriate dignity. The reception at Cedar Ridge's only saloon introduced Margaret to the social dynamics that would define her new life. The town's established families, led by Mayor Eugene Blackwood and his wife Catherine, maintained a polite but distant attitude toward the new bride. They were cordial enough, but Margaret sensed an underlying assessment taking place, a judgment about whether she possessed the strength and character necessary for frontier life. "Marriage out here isn't like back east," Catherine Blackwood explained during a brief conversation after the ceremony. "Women have to be partners in survival, not decorations in parlors. Thomas is a good man, but his ranch is isolated and the work is hard. Many Eastern women find the adjustment challenging." The warning was delivered with apparent kindness, but Margaret detected an undertone of skepticism about her prospects for success. She'd encountered similar doubt throughout her life, people who assumed that her quiet demeanor indicated weakness rather than simply a preference for observation over declaration. Dr. Jonathan Pierce, the town's physician, proved more welcoming than the mayor's wife. A man in his 50s who'd come west for his health after developing lung problems from city pollution. He understood the challenges of adaptation that Eastern transplants faced in frontier communities. "The isolation is the hardest part," he confided to Margaret during their introduction, "especially during winter months when travel becomes impossible. Having books helps, but nothing really prepares you for the silence and the responsibility of complete self-reliance." Margaret appreciated his honesty more than Catherine Blackwood's veiled warnings. She'd learned to value people who spoke directly about challenges rather than those who issued dire predictions disguised as helpful advice. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who served the growing population of Mexican and Native American families in the region. His presence at the reception surprised Margaret, given the Protestant nature of the ceremony, but Thomas explained that Father Santos often attended community gatherings regardless of religious affiliation. "Community is community," the priest said with a smile when Margaret expressed surprise at his attendance. "In frontier territories, we cannot afford to divide ourselves by denomination when survival often depends on cooperation." The wisdom of his words would prove prophetic sooner than anyone anticipated. As evening approached, Thomas and Margaret returned to their cabin to begin their married life together. The arrangement they'd negotiated through correspondence called for separate sleeping areas until they decided whether their practical partnership could develop into something more intimate. Thomas had built a small addition to the cabin with its own entrance, giving Margaret privacy while maintaining the appearance of conventional marriage that frontier society expected. Their first weeks together established routines that felt surprisingly natural. Thomas handled the outdoor work of ranch management, while Margaret took responsibility for household operations, cooking, and the administrative tasks that kept their small operation running efficiently. She proved adept at managing their limited resources, stretching supplies through careful planning and finding ways to improve their living conditions through small innovations and organizational improvements. Margaret also discovered that Thomas had understated his education and intelligence in their correspondence. He read voraciously during winter evenings, possessed a sophisticated understanding of cattle breeding and land management, and maintained a correspondence with agricultural colleges that kept him informed about developments in ranching techniques. Their conversations during long winter evenings revealed shared interests in literature, current events, and philosophical questions about progress and tradition. Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying Thomas's company in ways she hadn't expected when she'd answered his advertisement for a practical partnership. "I was afraid you'd find frontier life too harsh," Thomas admitted one evening as they sat by the fireplace reading separate books. "Your letters suggested someone educated and refined. I worried that the reality of ranch life would disappoint you." Margaret looked up from her book, considering how to respond. The truth was that frontier life demanded more physical endurance than she'd anticipated, but it also offered freedoms and responsibilities that had been denied to her in Boston society. She was making meaningful contributions to their household's success rather than simply waiting for someone else to determine her future. "I was afraid I'd disappoint you," she replied honestly, "that you'd discover I wasn't as capable as my letters suggested. But I think we're both proving more adaptable than either of us expected." Their growing mutual respect and affection might have developed into deeper love given time and continued isolation. But frontier life rarely allowed for gradual development of anything. Events had a way of forcing rapid decisions and revealing character under pressure. The first test came in early February, when a traveling merchant named Henry Walsh arrived at their cabin seeking shelter during a sudden snowstorm. Walsh had been caught in the open while traveling between settlements, and his horse had gone lame, leaving him stranded and facing possible death from exposure. Thomas immediately invited the stranger inside, providing food, warmth, and care for both Walsh and his injured horse. Margaret supported the decision without question, preparing a meal and offering their guests the use of their small spare room for as long as necessary. Walsh proved to be an interesting and educated companion during his 3-day stay. He brought news from other settlements, stories of life in different parts of the territory, and appreciation for their hospitality that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. "You've got something special here," Walsh told them before departing. "Most frontier couples are so focused on survival that they forget about hospitality and human kindness. You two understand that helping others is part of what makes communities survive in harsh places." His words proved prophetic in ways none of them could have anticipated. Within weeks, Margaret and Thomas would face a situation that would test not only their capacity for helping others, but their willingness to defy community pressure and risk their own survival for the sake of strangers in desperate need. The blizzard that would change everything began building on the horizon as Walsh disappeared down the mountain trail toward his next destination. Margaret watched the storm clouds gathering and felt an inexplicable sense of anticipation, as if the approaching weather carried more than just snow and wind. She was about to discover that sometimes the greatest tests of character come not from personal hardship, but from the choice between safety and service, when the lives of others hang in the balance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weather turned ominous on February 15th, 3 weeks after Henry Walsh had departed their homestead. Margaret woke to an unnatural stillness that seemed to press against the cabin walls like a living thing. The usual morning sounds, birds calling, cattle lowing, wind rustling through the pine trees, had vanished, replaced by a silence so complete it made her ears ring. Thomas was already up, standing at the kitchen window with his coffee cup forgotten in his hands. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who'd learned to read nature's warnings through decades of frontier survival. "How bad?" Margaret asked, joining him at the window. The sky had taken on a peculiar yellow-grey color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air felt thick and electric, charged with the kind of energy that preceded violent storms. "Bad enough that I need to get the cattle into the lower pasture today," Thomas replied grimly. "This has the feel of a 3-day blow, maybe worse. Temperature's going to drop fast, and when it does, anything caught in the open won't survive." Margaret had lived through New England winters, but nothing had prepared her for the raw fury of Colorado mountain weather. The storms here didn't just bring snow and wind. They transformed the landscape into something alien and hostile, where familiar landmarks disappeared and distances became meaningless. Thomas spent the morning moving their small herd to sheltered grazing areas closer to the barn, while Margaret prepared the cabin for extended isolation. She checked their food supplies, ensured they had adequate firewood stacked inside, and filled every available container with water from the well before it could freeze solid. By midday, the first snowflakes had begun to fall, not the gentle, picturesque snow of Christmas cards, but hard, driving pellets that stung exposed skin and accumulated with frightening speed. The wind picked up gradually, starting as a whisper through the trees and building to a steady moan that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "I need to ride to Cedar Ridge," Thomas announced as he returned from securing the barn. "Doc Pierce asked me to check on the Hendricks family. Old Samuel's been sick, and with this storm coming, they might need supplies or medical help." The Hendricks homestead lay 6 miles south, halfway to town. Samuel Hendricks was a veteran of the Civil War, whose lung damage from battlefield injuries had worsened over the harsh winter. His wife Eleanor and their 3 young children depended on neighbors for assistance during medical emergencies. Since Doc Pierce couldn't always reach their remote cabin in severe weather, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "Thomas, the storm's getting worse by the hour. What if you can't make it back?" "I'll make it back," Thomas said with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived countless frontier challenges. "But if something happens, you know where the emergency supplies are stored. There's enough food and fuel to last a month if you're careful." He paused, studying her face with concern. "Margaret, I need to know you'll be all right alone. This isn't Boston, where you can call for help if something goes wrong. Out here you have to be your own help." The question touched on fears Margaret had been suppressing since her arrival in Colorado. Despite her growing confidence in frontier life, she'd always had Thomas nearby as a safety net. The prospect of facing a major storm alone tested her sense of self-reliance in ways that daily ranch chores never had. "I'll be fine," she said, forcing conviction into her voice. "The Hendricks family needs help, and you're the only one close enough to provide it. That's more important than my comfort." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded with approval. "You're stronger than you know, Margaret. Don't forget that if things get difficult." He left within the hour, bundled in layers of wool and leather, leading his most reliable horse through snow that was already ankle-deep and rising fast. Margaret watched from the cabin window until he disappeared into the white curtain of falling snow, then turned her attention to preparing for what she now realized would be her first true test of frontier survival. The storm intensified throughout the afternoon with a violence that defied her eastern experience. Wind howled around the cabin with enough force to rattle the shutters and make the solid log walls creak ominously. Snow piled against the windows, gradually blocking the view and creating a sense of being buried alive. Margaret maintained her composure by focusing on practical tasks. She kept the fire burning steadily, monitored their food and water supplies, and checked periodically on the animals in the barn. The cattle had crowded together for warmth, their breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air, but they seemed secure enough in their shelter. As evening approached, the temperature plummeted with shocking speed. Margaret could hear trees cracking in the forest as sap froze and expanded, creating sounds like gunshots that punctuated the wind's constant roar. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the cabin's warmth, and she realized they were experiencing the kind of storm that became legend in frontier communities. She tried to read by lamplight, but concentration proved impossible with the storm raging outside and worry about Thomas gnawing at her thoughts. Had he reached the Hendricks family safely? Was he trapped there by the weather, or had he attempted the return journey and become lost in the blizzard? The first night passed in fitful sleep, interrupted by the storm's fury and her own anxiety. Margaret woke repeatedly to check the fire and listen for any sound that might indicate Thomas's return. Each time, she heard only the wind's relentless assault and the cabin's groaning response to the atmospheric pressure. Dawn brought no relief from the storm's intensity. If anything, the weather seemed more violent than the previous day, with wind gusts strong, enough to shake the entire structure in snow, falling so heavily that visibility extended. No more than a few feet from the cabin walls, Margaret forced herself to eat breakfast and maintain normal routines, understanding instinctively that panic would be more dangerous than the storm itself. She rationed the firewood carefully, knowing that their supply needed to last until conditions improved enough for her to safely venture outside for more fuel. The isolation was absolute and profound. No sound existed beyond the storm's fury, no movement visible through the snow-blocked windows. Margaret felt as though she'd been transported to another planet where human life existed only within the small circle of warmth and light that defined the cabin's interior. On the second day, a new sound penetrated the storm's noise, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the cabin's exterior walls. Margaret initially dismissed it as debris blown against the structure by the wind, but the sound's persistence and apparent intentionality gradually drew her attention. Someone, or something, was outside the cabin. Margaret approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Thomas might have returned, but in this weather, any living thing caught in the open would be desperate enough to take extreme measures for shelter. Bears, wolves, or even mountain cats had been known to attack human habitations when driven by starvation or cold. The thumping continued, accompanied now by what sounded like human voices calling through the wind. Margaret pressed her ear to the door, straining to distinguish words from the storm's roar. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Help us!" Pleas were freezing. Multiple voices, including what sounded like children, were calling from the other side of the door. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Who could be traveling in such weather? Where had they come from, and how had they found the cabin in near zero visibility? She cracked the door open just enough to peer outside, and what she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. 9 figures huddled against the cabin's wall, their clothes encrusted with ice, their faces blue with cold. Among them, she could make out at least 3 children, all barely conscious from exposure. Without hesitation, Margaret threw the door wide open. "Get inside! Quickly!" The group stumbled into the cabin's warmth, bringing with them snow, ice, and the sharp smell of extreme cold. As Margaret secured the door against the wind, she got her first clear look at her unexpected guests and realized she was facing a situation that would test every principle she'd ever held about human compassion and community responsibility. The adults were clearly Mexican or Native American, their features and clothing suggesting they were among the migrant workers who traveled between settlements seeking seasonal employment. The children ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 12, all showing signs of severe exposure to the elements. "Agua? Comida?" asked an older woman who seemed to be the group's leader. Her voice was weak but urgent as she gestured toward the children, who were shivering so violently they could barely stand. Margaret's rudimentary Spanish, learned from her father's business dealings with South American merchants, allowed her to understand the request for water and food. More importantly, she could see that these people were facing death from hypothermia if they didn't receive immediate medical attention. "See, Margaret responded, guiding the group toward the fireplace. "Sit here by the fire. I'll get blankets and hot food. As she worked to provide emergency care for 9 people suffering from severe cold exposure, Margaret's mind was already calculating the implications of her actions. These were clearly the kind of people that Cedar Ridge's established community viewed with suspicion and hostility. Mexican and Native American workers were tolerated when their labor was needed, but rarely welcomed as equals in frontier society. More critically, her food and fuel supplies, carefully rationed for 2 people during an extended storm, would now need to sustain 11 people for an unknown period. She was risking not just her own survival, but potentially Thomas's as well, when he returned from his mission to help the Hendricks family, the oldest man in the group, his face weathered by decades of outdoor work, managed to speak enough English to explain their situation. "We were traveling to work at the Miller Ranch. Storm caught us in the open. Lost our supplies. Been walking for 2 days, looking for shelter." The Miller Ranch lay 20 miles north of Thomas's homestead, a distance that might as well have been 200 in current conditions. These people had somehow survived 2 days in the worst storm Margaret had ever witnessed, walking through snow and wind that would have killed most travelers within hours. "How did you find our cabin?" Margaret asked as she distributed blankets and began preparing hot soup for the group. "Saw the smoke from your chimney," the man replied. "Followed it like a beacon. Thought we were going to die before we reached it." As Margaret worked to warm and feed her unexpected guests, she became aware of a growing problem that extended beyond simple logistics. When Thomas returned, assuming he could return safely, he would find their cabin occupied by exactly the kind of people who represented everything that Cedar Ridge's community leaders feared about uncontrolled immigration and social change. Thomas himself might be sympathetic to their plight, but helping them survive would require resources and create obligations that extended far beyond temporary shelter. These people would need food, clothing, and assistance reaching their destination once the storm ended. More importantly, they would need protection from community members who viewed their presence as a threat to established social order. Margaret realized she was facing the first major moral test of her marriage and her new life in Colorado territory. The safe choice would be to provide minimal assistance and encourage the group to move on as soon as weather conditions permitted. The compassionate choice would be to offer whatever help was necessary to ensure their survival, regardless of the personal and social consequences. As she ladled hot soup into bowls and watched color slowly return to faces that had been blue with cold just minutes before, Margaret made her decision. She would do whatever was necessary to save these 9 souls, even if it meant defying community expectations and risking her own standing. In Cedar Ridge society, she had no way of knowing that her choice would soon place her in direct conflict with town leaders, who viewed her actions as a dangerous precedent that threatened the very foundations of frontier social control. The 3rd day of the blizzard brought an eerie calm that Margaret knew was deceptive. The wind still howled, but with less ferocity, and the snow continued falling in thick, heavy flakes that suggested the storm was far from over. Inside the cabin, 9 strangers huddled around her fireplace, slowly recovering from their brush with death. Margaret had spent the night tending to the most severely affected, a young mother named Rosa, whose infant son, barely 8 months old, had nearly succumbed to hypothermia. The child's lips had been blue when they arrived, his breathing shallow and irregular. Only constant warmth and Rosa's determined nursing had pulled him back from the edge. "Gracias, Senora," Rosa whispered as she cradled her son near the fire. "You saved his life. You saved all our lives." The gratitude in the young woman's eyes was both heartwarming and terrifying. Margaret understood that she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. These weren't just temporary guests seeking shelter from a storm. They were people whose survival now depended entirely on her continued protection and support. The practical challenges were mounting by the hour. Her carefully rationed food supplies were dwindling rapidly. What should have lasted 2 people for weeks would barely sustain 11 people for days. The firewood that seemed adequate for a normal winter was being consumed at an alarming rate to keep the larger group warm. More concerning was the question of what would happen when the storm ended. The group's leader, an older man named Miguel Santos, had explained their situation in greater detail once he'd recovered enough strength to speak clearly. They were seasonal workers traveling between ranches, carrying minimal supplies and depending on reaching their destination before severe weather struck. "We worked the harvest at the Patterson place," Miguel explained in careful English. "Contract finished last week. Miller Ranch offered winter work, mending fences, caring for stock through the cold months. Good pay, but we had to be there by February 20th or lose the positions," Margaret calculated quickly. Today was February 18th. Even if the storm ended immediately, the group would need at least 2 days to reach the Miller Ranch through snow-clogged mountain passes. Their chances of arriving on time were virtually non-existent. "What happens if you don't reach Miller's Ranch by the 20th? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Miguel's weathered face grew grim. "Miller hire other workers. No jobs means no money for food, no shelter for winter. We have to keep moving, find work somewhere else before spring." The reality was stark and unforgiving. These people weren't just seeking temporary shelter, they were facing potential starvation if they couldn't find employment soon. Winter jobs for migrant workers were scarce, and established ranchers preferred hiring people they knew rather than strangers, arriving after contract deadlines. Margaret's contemplation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching through the snow. Her heart leaped with hope and relief as she recognized Thomas's distinctive whistle through the wind. He'd made it back safely from the Hendricks place. Thomas appeared at the door moments later, covered in snow and ice, leading his exhausted horse through drifts that reached the animal's chest. His face showed the strain of traveling through impossible conditions. But his eyes immediately took in the scene inside the cabin. 9 strangers warming themselves by his fireplace, consuming his food, occupying his home. Margaret watched her husband's expression carefully, looking for signs of anger, resentment, or fear. What she saw instead was the same calm assessment he brought to every challenge, frontier life presented. Thomas was evaluating the situation, not judging it. "Margaret," he said quietly, after securing his horse in the barn and joining the group inside. "What happened here?" Margaret explained the circumstances of the group's arrival, emphasizing their desperate condition and the life-or-death nature of their situation. As she spoke, she could see Thomas absorbing not just the facts, but the implications of their presence and her decision to provide shelter. "You did the right thing," Thomas said simply when she finished. "Anyone would have done the same." Miguel Santos rose slowly from his place by the fire, his dignity intact despite his desperate circumstances. "Senor Collins, we are grateful for your wife's kindness. We do not wish to impose on your hospitality longer than necessary. When the storm passes, we will continue our journey." Thomas studied the older man with respect. "Where are you headed, Mr. Santos?" "Miller Ranch for winter work. Though I fear we may be too late now." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The Miller place is 20 miles north through mountain passes that won't be clear for days, maybe weeks. Even when the storm ends, travel will be dangerous until the snow settles." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of multiple horses and voices calling through the wind. Margaret felt her stomach clench with apprehension as she recognized the authoritative tone of Mayor Eugene Blackwood cutting through the storm's noise. "Collins. Thomas Collins! We need to talk." Thomas moved to the window, wiping frost from the glass to peer outside. Margaret joined him and saw what she'd been dreading, a group of 6 men from Cedar Ridge, all mounted and armed, led by Mayor Blackwood and Sheriff William Tucker. Their presence during the worst storm in years could only mean they'd come on urgent business. "Stay inside," Thomas told the group quietly. "Let me handle this." He stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Margaret pressed her ear to the wood, straining to hear the conversation over the wind. What she caught made her blood run cold. Reports of suspicious activity. dangerous elements in the community, your responsibility as a citizen. The voices grew more heated, and Margaret could distinguish Mayor Blackwood's pompous tones from Sheriff Tucker's more measured responses. Dr. Pierce was among the group, which surprised her, along with several other men she recognized as prominent citizens of Cedar Ridge. After several minutes, Thomas returned inside, his face grim with purpose. The entire group watched him expectantly, understanding that their fate hung on whatever news he brought from the conversation outside. "They know you're here," Thomas said directly to Miguel Santos. "Someone saw smoke from our chimney that was too heavy for just 2 people. They've come to investigate." Margaret felt the careful world she'd been building begin to crumble. "What do they want?" "They want us to turn you over to their custody," Thomas said to the group. "They're concerned about vagrancy, public safety, and community resources. They've offered to escort you to the county seat, where you can apply for official assistance." The euphemisms were transparent. Margaret knew, as did everyone in the cabin, that escorting them to the county seat meant expelling them from the community and leaving them to fend for themselves in hostile territory during the worst winter weather in years. Miguel Santos straightened with quiet dignity. "We understand, Senor. We do not wish to cause trouble for you and your wife. We will go with them, if that is what you wish." Margaret watched Thomas's face as he considered his response. She could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes, the practical necessity of maintaining good relationships with community leaders versus the moral obligation to protect people whose lives depended on their continued shelter. "No," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You're guests in our home, and guests don't get turned away in weather like this. Anyone who says different can discuss it with me when the storm passes." The sound of approaching footsteps on the cabin's porch indicated that the discussion outside had concluded and the delegation was preparing to enter, whether invited or not. Margaret quickly positioned herself between the strangers and the door, while Thomas moved to intercept whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Mayor Blackwood pushed through the door without waiting for permission, followed by Sheriff Tucker and the rest of their party. The small cabin immediately felt overcrowded and tense as 2 distinct groups faced each other across cultural, social, and ideological divides that ran deeper than the storm raging outside. "Collins," Mayor Blackwood began in his most official tone, "as mayor of Cedar Ridge and representative of this community's interests, I'm ordering you to release these individuals into our custody for proper processing and relocation." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself directly between the mayor and his guests. "On what authority? These people haven't committed any crimes. They're seeking shelter during a life-threatening storm." Sheriff Tucker, clearly uncomfortable with his role in the confrontation, spoke up. "Thomas, they're trespassing on private property and consuming resources that belong to community members. We have reports they may be carrying diseases or other threats to public health." The accusation was so transparently false that Margaret felt compelled to respond. "Sheriff Tucker, I've been caring for these people for 2 days. They're suffering from exposure to cold, nothing more. Dr. Pierce can examine them if there are genuine health concerns." Dr. Pierce, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Margaret, the community has concerns about precedent. If word spreads that Cedar Ridge provides sanctuary for transient populations, we could be overwhelmed by people seeking assistance we can't provide." Margaret stared at the physician she'd respected since her arrival in Colorado Territory. "Dr. Pierce, you took an oath to do no harm. How does turning sick people out into a blizzard align with that oath?" The moral challenge hung in the air like smoke from their fire. Margaret could see doubt creeping into the faces of several delegation members as they were forced to confront the reality of what they were demanding. Mayor Blackwood, sensing his authority being questioned, adopted a more threatening tone. "Collins, your cooperation in this matter will be remembered by the community. Your lack of cooperation will also be remembered. I trust you understand the implications for your future standing in Cedar Ridge. The threat was clear and comprehensive. Defying the mayor's demands could result in social ostracism, economic boycotts, and exclusion from the community networks that made frontier survival possible. Thomas and Margaret could find themselves as isolated and vulnerable as the people they were trying to protect. Margaret watched her husband's face as he weighed the consequences of his decision. She saw the moment when calculation gave way to principle, when practical considerations yielded to moral conviction. "Mayor Blackwood," Thomas said with quiet authority, "these people are staying in my home until the storm passes and it's safe for them to travel. If that creates problems for you or anyone else in Cedar Ridge, we'll address those problems when lives aren't hanging in the balance." The mayor's face flushed with anger at being defied so publicly. "Very well, Collins. But understand that your choice has consequences. When these people bring trouble to our community, and they will, the responsibility lies entirely with you." As the delegation prepared to leave, Sheriff Tucker made one final attempt at compromise. "Thomas, at least consider limiting their stay to the minimum necessary for survival. The longer they remain, the more difficult this situation becomes for everyone involved." Margaret stepped forward before Thomas could respond. "Sheriff, when exactly does human compassion become inconvenient enough to abandon? When does community safety justify letting children freeze to death in a blizzard?" Her questions cut to the heart of the moral crisis that would define Cedar Ridge's character for generations to come. The storm outside was temporary, but the choices being made during its fury would echo through the community's history long after the snow melted. As the delegation rode away into the blizzard, Margaret and Thomas faced the realization that they'd crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer just providing temporary shelter. They were openly defying community, authority, and accepting responsibility for consequences that could destroy everything they'd built. Together, the 9 souls huddled around their fireplace represented more than people in need of help. They had become the focal point of a struggle between 2 visions of what frontier communities could become, one based on exclusion and control, the other on inclusion and mutual support. Margaret looked at Thomas, seeing in his face the same determination she felt growing within herself. They would see this through to whatever end awaited, knowing that some principles were worth any price their community might demand them to pay. The storm finally broke on the 5th day, leaving behind a transformed landscape that sparkled under brilliant sunshine. Snow drifts reached the cabin's windows on the north side, while the wind had sculpted otherworldly formations that made familiar landmarks unrecognizable. The silence after days of howling wind felt almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of tree branches adjusting to their heavy burden of ice and snow. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Miguel Santos and his oldest son Carlos dig a path from the cabin to the barn. The group had insisted on contributing to the household work despite their weakened condition, and their efforts had proven invaluable. They'd helped Thomas care for the livestock, maintained the fires during the night, and shared cooking duties that had stretched their limited food supplies further than Margaret had thought possible. "They're good people," Thomas said quietly, joining her at the window. "Hard workers, grateful for help, respectful of our home." "Everything Blackwood and his crowd claimed they weren't," Margaret nodded, watching Carlos patiently teach one of the younger children how to shovel snow efficiently. The past few days had revealed the character of their unexpected guests in ways that contradicted every stereotype she'd heard about migrant workers. Miguel Santos spoke 3 languages and had once taught school in Mexico before economic circumstances forced him to seek work in America. Rosa, the young mother, possessed sophisticated knowledge of herbal medicine that had helped treat minor ailments among the group. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. The question had been weighing on her mind since the storm's end became apparent. Their guests were strong enough to travel, but venturing into the post-storm landscape remained dangerous. More importantly, the community's hostility hadn't disappeared with the blizzard. Thomas had no immediate answer. The Miller Ranch contract was lost. No employer would honor agreements with workers who arrived a week late, regardless of circumstances. Other winter employment opportunities were scarce, and traveling to distant settlements would require supplies the group couldn't afford. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the riders, Sheriff Tucker and Deputy James Morrison, accompanied by two men she didn't know, but whose official bearing suggested they represented authority from beyond Cedar Ridge's boundaries. "Trouble," Thomas muttered, moving toward the door. "Stay inside while I see what they want." Margaret ignored his instruction, following him onto the porch. She'd learned that community conflicts were less likely to escalate when witnessed by multiple people, and she suspected her presence might encourage more civilized behavior from their visitors. Sheriff Tucker dismounted with obvious reluctance, his expression suggesting he was acting under orders rather than personal conviction. "Morning, Thomas, Margaret. I'm afraid we need to discuss the situation with your guests." The pause before guests carried enough emphasis to make Tucker's true opinion clear. He introduced the strangers as Agent Harrison from the Territorial Immigration Office and Agent Walsh from the Federal Marshal's Service. Both men studied the cabin and its surroundings with the calculating gaze of officials accustomed to making arrests. "Mr. Collins," Agent Harrison began in a tone that brooked no disagreement, "we've received reports of unauthorized persons residing on your property. We're here to investigate their legal status and determine appropriate action." Margaret felt cold dread settling in her stomach. The involvement of federal authorities suggested that Mayor Blackwood had escalated the situation far beyond local politics. Immigration enforcement carried serious consequences that could include imprisonment and forced deportation. "These people sought emergency shelter during a life-threatening storm," Thomas replied carefully. "They're guests in our home, not unauthorized residents." Agent Walsh stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Sir, we need to examine their documentation and question them about their presence in this territory. Please ask them to come outside." The request was phrased politely, but Margaret recognized the underlying threat. Cooperation was expected, not requested, and refusal would likely result in forced entry and arrests. "I'll get them," Margaret said before Thomas could respond. She needed to warn Miguel Santos and his group about what they were facing, though she suspected they understood immigration enforcement better than she did. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere changed immediately when Margaret explained the situation. The adults exchanged glances that spoke of previous encounters with similar officials, while the children moved instinctively closer to their parents. This wasn't their first experience with government agents questioning their right to exist in American territory. "We have papers," Miguel Santos said quietly, producing a worn leather pouch from his coat. "Work permits, contracts, letters from employers, everything legal and proper." Margaret felt a surge of relief, but Miguel's expression remained grim. Legal documentation didn't guarantee fair treatment, especially when local authorities were determined to find problems. The group filed outside with dignity that impressed Margaret despite their obvious fear. They arranged themselves in a respectful line facing the officials, with Miguel Santos serving as their spokesman and the children standing behind the adults for protection. Agent Harrison examined their documents with theatrical thoroughness, checking dates, signatures, and official seals, while his partner studied each person as though memorizing their faces for future reference. The process continued for nearly an hour, during which no one spoke except the agents asking occasional questions in broken Spanish. "These work permits expired 6 weeks ago," Agent Harrison announced finally. "You're in violation of territorial immigration regulations. I have authority to place you under arrest, pending deportation proceedings." Margaret felt her world tilting. The permits had expired during the gap between their last job and their journey to the Miller Ranch. a common situation for seasonal workers whose employment status fluctuated with agricultural cycles. The violation was technical rather than intentional, but it provided legal justification for whatever action the authorities chose to take. "Agent Harrison," Thomas said carefully, "these people were traveling to new employment when the storm trapped them. They weren't trying to evade immigration requirements." "Intent isn't relevant," Agent Walsh replied coldly. "Expired documentation means illegal presence. The law is clear on this matter." Margaret watched the scene unfolding with growing horror. The same people who'd shared their meals, helped with household chores, and shown nothing but gratitude for assistance were being treated like criminals for the crime of seeking survival during a natural disaster. "What are their options?" she asked, stepping forward despite Thomas's warning glance. Agent Harrison studied her with surprise, as though he hadn't expected a woman to insert herself into official proceedings. "Ma'am, this isn't your concern. These individuals will be processed according to federal regulations. They're guests in my home," Margaret replied firmly. "That makes it very much my concern." The agent's expression hardened. "Mrs. Collins, harboring individuals with illegal status is a federal offense. I suggest you distance yourself from this situation before you face charges as well." The threat was explicit and terrifying. Margaret realized she was standing at a crossroads that would define not just her own future, but her understanding of what kind of person she was willing to be. "Agent Harrison," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "what exactly happens to these people if you arrest them?" "They'll be transported to the territorial capital for deportation proceedings. Standard process for immigration violations." Margaret knew enough about frontier justice to understand what standard process meant. The group would be held in whatever facilities were available, fed minimal rations, and eventually transported to the Mexican border, regardless of their actual origins or family situations. Children would be separated from parents, and medical care would be non-existent. "How long does that process take?" she pressed. Agent Walsh answered with bureaucratic precision. "Anywhere from several weeks to several months, depending on caseloads and transportation availability. Several months of imprisonment for the crime of having paperwork that expired during a job transition." Margaret felt anger building inside her. Not the hot fury of immediate reaction, but the cold determination of someone whose core values were being challenged. Miguel Santos stepped forward with quiet dignity. "Senora Collins, you and your husband have done enough. We do not wish to bring more trouble to your family. We will go with these men." His willingness to accept arrest to protect them from further consequences only strengthened Margaret's resolve. She turned to Sheriff Tucker, who had remained silent throughout the federal agent's interrogation. "Sheriff, you've known Thomas for years. Do you really believe he's harboring criminals?" Tucker shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret, I know Thomas is a good man, but federal law is federal law. This situation is beyond local jurisdiction." "Then let me ask you this," Margaret continued. "If your own family was trapped in a blizzard and found shelter with strangers, would you want those strangers arrested for helping them survive?" The question struck home. Tucker had 3 young children of his own, and every parent in Colorado Territory understood how quickly weather could turn deadly. His moral discomfort was visible as he struggled to reconcile his personal convictions with his official duties. Agent Harrison grew impatient with the discussion. "Enough debate. We have our orders. Mr. Santos, please gather your belongings. You and your group are coming with us." Margaret made her decision. "No, they're not." The simple declaration stunned everyone present. Agent Walsh actually laughed at what he apparently considered feminine hysteria. "Ma'am, you can't obstruct federal law enforcement." "I'm not obstructing anything," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm exercising my rights as a property owner. These people are my invited guests, and I'm not withdrawing that invitation." Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, understanding immediately what she was attempting. "Agent Harrison, if you want to arrest our guests, you'll need a warrant to enter our property." The legal challenge caught both agents off guard. They'd expected intimidation and compliance. not constitutional resistance from educated frontier residents who understood their rights. "We don't need warrants for immigration violations," Agent Walsh blustered, but his uncertainty was evident. "You need warrants to enter private property without consent," Thomas replied firmly. "And you don't have our consent." Agent Harrison's face flushed with anger at being defied by civilians who should have been intimidated by federal authority. "Mr. Collins, you're making a serious mistake. We can get warrants, and when we do, the charges against you will be much more severe." "Then get your warrants," Margaret said quietly. "Until then, these people remain our guests." The standoff stretched for several tense minutes as the agents weighed their options. They could attempt to force the issue, but doing so would require violating constitutional protections that might invalidate any arrests they made. More importantly, their actions were being witnessed by local law enforcement who could testify about procedural violations. Sheriff Tucker finally broke the silence. "Agents, maybe we should return to town and discuss this situation with proper legal counsel. Make sure everything's done according to proper procedure." His suggestion provided a face-saving retreat for the federal agents while buying time for Margaret and Thomas to find alternative solutions. Agent Harrison clearly wanted to reject the advice, but Agent Walsh seemed relieved to avoid a confrontation that could compromise their authority. "Very well," Agent Harrison said coldly. "But understand that this delay is temporary. We'll return with proper documentation, and when we do, anyone who obstructs our duties will face the full consequences of federal law." As the officials rode away, Margaret felt both triumph and terror. They'd won a temporary victory, but the price of defiance was escalating beyond anything she'd imagined. When she first opened her door to desperate strangers seeking shelter from a storm, Thomas put his arm around her shoulders as they watched the riders disappear. "Margaret, you know they'll be back, probably with enough legal authority to arrest all of us." "I know," Margaret replied, "but some things are worth the risk." Miguel Santos approached them with tears in his eyes. Senor, we cannot let you face prison for our sake. When the agents return, we will go with them willingly." Margaret turned to face the man whose dignity had impressed her from the first moment they met. "Mr. Santos, when I married Thomas, I promised to honor him for better or worse. Today, I learned that honoring him means honoring the principles that make him the man I chose to marry." She looked at the faces surrounding her. Thomas, Miguel Santos, Rosa and her baby, the children who had found safety in her home. Sometimes the worst circumstances reveal what we're truly capable of becoming. I'm not ready to let fear decide who that person is. The battle lines were drawn, and Margaret Collins understood there would be no retreat from the choice she'd made. In defying federal authority to protect strangers, she'd discovered something about herself that no amount of frontier hardship had revealed: a capacity for moral courage that would be tested to its absolute limits. In the days ahead, the next morning brought visitors Margaret hadn't expected: Dr. Jonathan Pierce and Father Miguel. Santos arrived together on horseback, their faces grim with purpose. Margaret watched from the cabin window as they dismounted and approached the door with the deliberate movements of men carrying heavy news. "Dr. Pierce, Father Santos," Thomas greeted them on the porch. "This is unexpected. What brings you out so early?" Dr. Pierce removed his hat, his weathered face showing the strain of a sleepless night. "Thomas, Margaret, we need to talk about what happened yesterday and what's coming next." Margaret invited them inside, where the morning routine was already underway. Rosa was preparing breakfast, while Miguel Santos and Carlos worked to repair a broken harness. The children sat quietly by the fire, practicing letters that Miguel had been teaching, them using charcoal on pieces of bark, the scene of domestic tranquility seemed to affect both visitors profoundly. Dr. Pierce studied the family dynamics with the eye of someone reconsidering previously held assumptions, while Father Santos observed the educational activities with obvious approval. "Mrs. Collins," Dr. Pierce began carefully, "I owe you an apology for my behavior yesterday. I let community pressure override my professional judgment, and I'm ashamed of that failure." Margaret was surprised by his directness. She'd expected continued opposition from established community leaders, not admissions of conscience. "Dr. Pierce, you were trying to balance competing responsibilities. I understand the position you were in." "No," he replied firmly. "There was no balance to be struck. My medical oath requires me to help people in need, regardless of their legal status or community standing. Yesterday I violated that oath because I was more concerned about social pressure than human welfare." Father Santos nodded his agreement. "Dr. Pierce came to me last night, troubled by what had transpired. We spent hours discussing the moral implications of what the community is demanding. Thomas offered both men coffee and chairs by the fire." "What conclusion did you reach?" "That we cannot stand by while federal agents arrest people whose only crime was seeking shelter during a life-threatening storm," Dr. Pierce replied. "Whatever legal technicalities they may have violated, the moral law is clear. We help those in need." Margaret felt a surge of hope tempered by caution. "Dr. Pierce, supporting us publicly could cost you everything. Your medical practice, your standing in the community, your relationships with people who've trusted you for years." "Some things matter more than social standing," the doctor replied. "My wife died 3 years ago because I couldn't reach her during a similar storm. If strangers had found her and provided shelter, I would have been grateful beyond words. How can I now condemn others for providing the same mercy I would have prayed for?" Father Santos leaned forward in his chair, his expression intense with conviction. "Mrs. Collins, the gospel is clear about our obligations to strangers and refugees. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. This isn't a matter of immigration policy, it's a test of Christian faith." Miguel Santos, who had been listening to the conversation while working on the harness, looked up with surprise. "Father, you speak my language well. Are you from Mexico?" "I was born in New Mexico territory," Father Santos replied in fluent Spanish. "My family has lived in this region for 4 generations. We understand what it means to become strangers in our own land." The connection between the two men was immediate and profound. Margaret realized that Father Santos possessed perspectives on immigration and belonging that most Cedar Ridge residents couldn't understand. His family had experienced the transformation of Mexican territory into American land, making them intimately familiar with questions of legal status and cultural acceptance. "Father," Margaret said carefully, "if you support us publicly, won't you face the same community backlash we're facing?" "Probably worse," Father Santos admitted. "Mayor Blackwood has never been comfortable with having a Mexican-American priest in his community. He tolerates me because the church hierarchy appointed me, but he's looking for reasons to demand my transfer." Dr. Pierce set down his coffee cup with determination. "Then we need to be strategic about how we proceed. Margaret, Thomas, you can't fight federal agents alone. But if we can demonstrate community support for your actions, we might be able to create enough political pressure to influence how this situation is resolved." "What kind of community support?" Thomas asked skeptically. "Most people in Cedar Ridge seem to agree with Mayor Blackwood's position." "Most of the vocal people," Dr. Pierce corrected. "But there are others who haven't spoken up yet. Families who understand what it means to need help from strangers. People who came west themselves, seeking better opportunities." Margaret thought about the residents she'd met since arriving in Colorado territory. Beyond the established families like the Blackwoods, there were immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia who'd faced their own challenges gaining acceptance in American communities. "Dr. Pierce," she said slowly, "what exactly are you proposing?" "A community meeting, tonight, before the federal agents can return with their warrants. Give people a chance to hear Miguel Santos and his family speak for themselves. Let them see these are real people with real stories, not the threats Mayor Blackwood has been describing." Father Santos nodded enthusiastically. "Many of our parishioners have Mexican heritage. They understand the situation these people face, but they've been afraid to speak up because of their own vulnerable status." The proposal was audacious and risky. A public meeting would force the entire community to choose sides in a conflict that many residents preferred to avoid. It would also give Mayor Blackwood and his allies an opportunity to organize opposition and potentially turn the gathering into a hostile confrontation. Where would we hold such a meeting? Margaret asked. Mayor Blackwood controls access to the town hall. The church. Father Santos replied immediately. It's neutral ground, and church law protects the right of sanctuary. Even Mayor Blackwood wouldn't dare interfere with a religious gathering. Thomas looked at Miguel Santos, who had stopped working to listen to the discussion. Mr. Santos, what do you think? Are you willing to speak publicly about your situation? Miguel Santos considered the question carefully before responding. Senor Collins, we have been hiding our true selves for so long, speaking only when spoken to, trying to make ourselves invisible to avoid trouble. Perhaps it is time to stand up and show this community who we really are. Rosa looked up from the breakfast preparations, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. Miguel is right. We have nothing to be ashamed of. We work hard, we care for our families, we respect the law. If people knew our stories, maybe they would understand we are not threats. Margaret felt her resolve solidifying. The meeting was risky, but continued hiding was equally dangerous. When the federal agents returned with warrants, public opinion might be the only factor that could influence how aggressively they pursued arrests and deportations. Dr. Pierce, she said, how do we organize this meeting without giving Mayor Blackwood time to sabotage it? Word of mouth, the doctor replied. Father Santos and I will spend the day visiting families individually. Personal conversations are more persuasive than public announcements and harder for Blackwood to counter. What should we tell people the meeting is about? Thomas asked. Father Santos smiled grimly. The truth, that our community is facing a moral test that will define what kind of place Cedar Ridge becomes. Whether we're the kind of people who help strangers in need or the kind who turn them away to protect our own comfort. The plan was ambitious, requiring them to contact dozens of families within hours and convince them to attend a controversial gathering that could divide the community permanently. But Margaret understood that decisive action was necessary. Waiting for the federal agents to return would leave them facing arrest with no community support and no alternatives. There's something else we need to consider, Dr. Pierce said, as they finalized their plans. Mayor Blackwood won't ignore this meeting. He'll attend, probably with supporters, and he'll try to turn it into a forum for his position. We need to be prepared for confrontation. Margaret had been thinking about the same problem. Then we make sure it's not just about defending Miguel Santos and his family. We make it about what kind of community Cedar Ridge wants to be. What do you mean? Father Santos asked. I mean, we talk about all the times this community has helped people in need. All the families who've been welcomed here when they were struggling. All the ways that cooperation and mutual support have made frontier life possible. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she developed her thoughts. We remind people that everyone in Colorado Territory was a stranger once, looking for help and hoping for acceptance. Thomas nodded with approval. Make it about our values, not just this specific situation. Exactly. Mayor Blackwood wants to frame this as a choice between safety and danger. We frame it as a choice between the community we are and the community we want to become. Dr. Pierce stood up, energized by the developing strategy. I'll start with the Peterson family. They came here from Sweden with nothing but hope and determination. They'll understand what Miguel's family is facing. Father Santos rose as well. I'll speak with the Martinez and Gonzalez families. They've been afraid to get involved, but they know their own status could be questioned if this precedent is established. As the two men prepared to leave, Margaret felt compelled to voice one final concern. Dr. Pierce, Father Santos, if this meeting goes badly, if the community turns against us, you'll be associated with our position. Are you certain you want to take that risk? Dr. Pierce paused at the door, his expression resolute. Mrs. Collins, I became a doctor to help people heal. Yesterday I realized that sometimes healing requires more than medicine. It requires moral courage. I'm ready to find out if I possess that courage. Father Santos nodded his agreement. Margaret, my faith teaches that we are all strangers seeking sanctuary in God's kingdom. If I cannot defend earthly strangers seeking temporary shelter, how can I call myself a servant of the divine? After they left, Margaret and Thomas spent the afternoon preparing for what might be the most important evening of their lives. They helped Miguel Santos and his family practice telling their stories in English, coached the children on how to behave during a formal gathering, and discussed strategies for responding to hostile questions or accusations. As evening approached, Margaret found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate woman fleeing an uncertain future in Boston. Now she was preparing to risk everything she'd built, for the sake of principles she'd discovered within herself through the crucible of frontier life. Thomas, she said as they prepared to leave for the church, whatever happens tonight, I want you to know I've never been more proud to be your wife than I am right now. Thomas took her hand, his weathered fingers intertwining with hers. Margaret, when I advertised for a wife, I was looking for a partner who could help me survive frontier life. I never imagined I'd find someone who would teach me what it means to truly live. As they walked toward the church with Miguel Santos and his family, Margaret could see lights glowing in windows throughout Cedar Ridge. Behind each light was a family facing the same choice she and Thomas had made, whether to stand with strangers in need or protect themselves from the consequences of compassion. The outcome of the evening's meeting would determine not just the fate of 9 people seeking safety, but the moral character of an entire community balanced on the edge between fear and faith. The Cedar Ridge Community Church had never held so many people within its modest wooden walls. Margaret stood at the back of the sanctuary, watching families file through the doors, with expressions ranging from curious to hostile to deeply conflicted. The pews that typically accommodated Sunday worship for 60 parishioners now strained to hold nearly twice that number as word of the meeting had spread throughout the valley. Mayor Eugene Blackwood arrived precisely at 7 o'clock. Flanked by Sheriff Tucker and a contingent of supporters that included the town's wealthiest ranchers and business owners. They claimed the front 2 rows, with the territorial authority of people accustomed to controlling community discourse. Margaret noticed that several carried papers, prepared statements or legal documents they intended to use against her position. But she also saw faces that gave her hope. The Peterson family from Sweden sat midway back, their weathered hands folded in their laps as they studied Miguel Santos and his family with the recognition of fellow immigrants. Maria Gonzalez, who ran the town's small bakery, had brought her teenage sons, despite obvious nervousness about attending such a controversial gathering. Father Santos opened the meeting with a prayer that carefully avoided taking sides while emphasizing themes of compassion and community responsibility. Lord, grant us wisdom to see clearly, courage to speak truthfully, and hearts open to your guidance as we wrestle with difficult questions together. Margaret had agreed to speak first, understanding that her role as the community's newest member might allow her to address conflicts that longtime residents were too invested in to discuss objectively. She stood before the assembled crowd, feeling the weight of dozens of gazes, measuring her character and resolve. Friends and neighbors, she began, her voice carrying clearly in the church's acoustics. 6 months ago, I stepped off a train in Denver as a stranger seeking a new life in Colorado Territory. Thomas Collins offered me partnership and marriage without knowing anything about my character except what I'd written in letters. He took a chance on someone he'd never met because he believed in the possibility of building something together. She paused, letting the parallel sink in before continuing. 3 weeks ago, 9 strangers appeared at our door during the worst blizzard any of us can remember. They weren't seeking marriage or permanent residence. They were seeking survival. We offered them shelter because we believed that helping people in desperate need was what decent human beings do. Mayor Blackwood shifted impatiently in his front row seat, clearly eager to present his counter-argument. But Father Santos had established ground rules requiring speakers to finish their presentations before facing questions. Protecting Margaret from immediate interruption, "I want to tell you who these people really are," Margaret continued, gesturing toward Miguel Santos and his family, who sat in the third row with quiet dignity despite being the focus of intense scrutiny. Miguel Santos taught school in Mexico for 15 years before economic hardship forced him to seek work in America. He speaks 3 languages and has been teaching the children in his group to read and write using whatever materials he can find. She pointed to Rosa, who held her infant son with protective care. Rosa Martinez studied herbal medicine with her grandmother and has helped treat minor ailments among the group using knowledge passed down through generations. She's not a threat to our community. She's someone whose skills could benefit us all. Margaret could see shifting expressions throughout the congregation as she presented individual stories, rather than abstract arguments about immigration policy. Real faces and personal narratives were harder to dismiss than political rhetoric about dangerous outsiders. Carlos Santos, Miguel's eldest son, is 16 years old and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. He spent hours helping Thomas care for our livestock, demonstrating knowledge about animal husbandry that comes from years of working with cattle and horses. She moved through each family member, providing specific details that contradicted stereotypes about migrant workers as ignorant or dangerous. The children's obvious intelligence, the adults' work ethic, and their respectful behavior in the church setting were creating cognitive dissonance for people who'd accepted Mayor Blackwood's characterizations without question. These people aren't asking for charity, Margaret concluded. They're asking for the same chance Thomas gave me, an opportunity to prove their worth through their actions, rather than being judged by their origins or their circumstances. As Margaret returned to her seat, Mayor Blackwood rose with the confident bearing of someone who'd spent years dominating community meetings. His prepared statement emerged from his coat pocket as he approached the front of the church. "Friends," he began with practiced authority, "Mrs. Collins speaks eloquently about individual stories, but we cannot allow emotional appeals to cloud our judgment about serious policy matters. We're dealing with federal immigration law, not personal charity." He unfolded his papers with theatrical precision. "I have here documentation from the Territorial Immigration Office confirming that these individuals are in violation of their work permits. Harboring people with illegal status makes all of us complicit in federal crimes." Margaret felt her stomach clench as Blackwood shifted the discussion back to legal technicalities that were harder for ordinary citizens to evaluate than moral arguments about helping neighbors in need. "More importantly," Blackwood continued, "and we must consider the precedent this situation establishes. If word spreads that Cedar Ridge provides sanctuary for people fleeing immigration enforcement, we could be overwhelmed by migrants seeking the same protection. Our resources are limited, our community is small, and we cannot become a refuge for everyone facing difficult circumstances." Several heads nodded among his supporters. The argument about being overwhelmed by refugees appealed to practical fears that were easier to articulate than moral objections to helping people in need. Sheriff Tucker will confirm that federal agents have legal authority to arrest these individuals and anyone who continues harboring them. Mrs. Collins may believe she's acting from noble motives, but she's putting law-abiding citizens at risk of federal prosecution. Sheriff Tucker stood reluctantly when called upon, his discomfort evident. Mayor Blackwood is correct about federal authority. The agents who visited the Collins homestead have legal grounds for arrests once they return with proper warrants, but instead of reinforcing Blackwood's argument, Tucker surprised the assembly by continuing, "However, I want to add something about the legal situation. Federal agents are required to follow constitutional procedures, including warrant requirements for searches of private property. Mrs. Collins, was within her rights to demand proper documentation before allowing entry to her home. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward the sheriff, who was providing legal support for her position, despite obvious pressure from Mayor Blackwood to present a unified official front. Dr. Pierce rose from his seat without waiting for formal recognition. "Mayor Blackwood, I'd like to address the medical aspects of this situation. I examined all 9 individuals yesterday, and I can confirm they pose no health threats to our community. They're suffering from exposure to severe weather, nothing more." The doctor's professional authority carried weight with families who depended on his medical expertise. His public support undermined claims about disease or other health risks that Blackwood had been circulating through unofficial channels. "Furthermore," Dr. Pierce continued, "I want to remind this community that we've never required legal documentation from people seeking emergency medical care. When the Henderson family's barn burned last year, we didn't check their property deeds before organizing relief efforts. When the Williamson children fell through pond ice, we didn't verify their birth certificates before pulling them out of the water." His examples were carefully chosen to resonate with specific families present in the church. Margaret could see recognition and guilt crossing faces as people remembered their own experiences receiving help without bureaucratic conditions. Father Santos stood to address the spiritual dimensions of the conflict. "As your pastor, I want to remind everyone that our faith calls us to welcome strangers and care for those in need. The gospel doesn't include exceptions for people whose paperwork has expired or who come from different countries." He opened his Bible to a passage he'd clearly selected in advance. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." The biblical reference carried special authority in a community where religious faith provided moral guidance for difficult decisions. Even families who might disagree with Father Santos's politics couldn't easily dismiss scriptural commands about treating strangers with compassion. Margaret watched the emotional currents flowing through the congregation as speakers presented competing visions of community identity and responsibility. The meeting was becoming a referendum, not just on Miguel Santos and his family, but on what kind of place Cedar Ridge wanted to be. Maria Gonzalez surprised everyone by rising from her seat, her hands shaking with nervousness as she prepared to speak publicly for the first time in community memory. "I want to say something," she began in accented English that reflected her own immigrant background. 20 years ago, my husband and I came here from Mexico with nothing but hope and determination to work hard. Some people were kind to us, helped us get started. Others treated us like threats or burdens." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "The people who helped us made this community stronger. The people who feared us made it smaller and meaner." Her testimony electrified the room because it came from someone whose success story contradicted fears about Mexican immigrants draining community resources or threatening established families. "Miguel Santos and his family are good. People caught in bad circumstances," Maria continued. "If we help them, they will remember our kindness and become the kind of neighbors who help others when their turn comes. If we abandon them, we become the kind of community that abandons anyone when it becomes inconvenient to care." As Maria sat down, Margaret realized the meeting had reached its crucial turning point. The abstract debate about immigration policy had become a concrete choice between competing visions of community character. People were being forced to choose not just sides in a political argument, but fundamental approaches to human relationships and moral responsibility. Mayor Blackwood sensed his position eroding and made a final appeal to fear and self-preservation. "Ladies and gentlemen, sentiment cannot override law. Federal agents will return within days, probably hours. Anyone who continues supporting these lawbreakers will face arrest, prosecution, and potential imprisonment. Is Mrs. Collins's gesture of defiance worth destroying your own family's security?" The threat was explicit and terrifying. Margaret understood that Blackwood was forcing people to choose between their principles and their safety, betting that self-preservation would triumph over moral conviction when the stakes were clearly defined. Thomas Collins stood up in the back of the church, his presence commanding immediate attention. As one of the community's most respected members, his words would carry enormous influence on the final outcome. "Mayor Blackwood," Thomas said in his quiet, authoritative voice, "you're asking us to choose between fear and faith, between protecting ourselves and protecting others, between being the kind of community that helps people in need and the kind that turns them away when it becomes complicated." He paused, looking directly at families throughout the congregation. "I want to remind everyone that we've all faced times when we needed help from neighbors. When storms damaged our property, when illness struck our families, when economic hardship threatened our survival. In those moments, we didn't want people to ask about our documentation or our legal status, and we wanted them to act with compassion and generosity." Thomas's voice grew stronger as he reached his conclusion. "Margaret and I are willing to face whatever consequences come from helping people who needed shelter during a blizzard. The question facing this community is whether you're willing to support the kind of neighbors who help others, or whether you'll abandon us to protect yourselves from imaginary threats." The challenge hung in the church air like incense, forcing every family to confront their own moral courage and community loyalty. Margaret realized that the evening had become more than a debate about 9 specific individuals. It had become a defining moment that would determine Cedar Ridge's character for generations to come. The vote that followed Thomas's speech revealed a community more divided than anyone had anticipated. Father Santos had suggested a simple show of hands, those supporting the Collins family's right to provide sanctuary, and those supporting immediate compliance with federal demands. The result was 34 hands raised in support, 28 opposed, with several families abstaining from what they clearly viewed as an impossible choice. Margaret felt simultaneous relief and dread as she watched the count. Support had prevailed, but by a margin so narrow that it guaranteed continued conflict rather than resolution. The families who'd voted against them weren't going to quietly accept minority status on an issue they viewed as fundamental to community, safety and legal order. Mayor Blackwood's face flushed with anger as he processed the unexpected defeat. "This is not a democracy," he announced to the assembly. "Federal law doesn't change based on popular opinion. When those agents return with arrest warrants, community sentiment won't protect anyone from prosecution." Dr. Pierce stood again, his medical authority lending weight to his response. "Mayor Blackwood, you're correct that federal law supersedes local preferences, but you're wrong about community sentiment being irrelevant. Federal agents operate more cautiously when they know their actions are being observed and documented by organized citizens." The doctor's comment introduced a strategic element that Margaret hadn't considered. Federal agents might have legal authority to make arrests, but they preferred operating in situations where local officials and community leaders supported their actions. Organized resistance could complicate their mission even if it couldn't prevent it entirely. Sheriff Tucker stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his dual loyalties to federal authority and community harmony creating an impossible situation. "Folks, I need to be clear about something. Federal agents will return probably within 24 hours. When they do, they'll have legal warrants that I'm obligated to support." He paused, looking directly at Margaret and Thomas. "However, they'll also need local assistance to execute those warrants effectively. My department's cooperation isn't automatic. It's based on our assessment of whether federal action served legitimate law enforcement purposes or create unnecessary community conflict." Margaret understood the subtle message Tucker was sending. He couldn't openly defy federal authority, but he could influence how aggressively that authority was exercised through his level of cooperation and support. Miguel Santos rose from his seat, surprising everyone by addressing the assembly directly. His English, while accented, was clear and dignified as he spoke to the people debating his family's fate. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank everyone who has spoken in support of my family tonight. Your kindness gives us hope that good people still exist in this world. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd experienced both cruelty and compassion from strangers. But I also want to say something to those who fear us. We do not want to take anything from your community. We do not want to change your way of life or challenge your values. We want only the chance to work honestly and raise our children in safety. He gestured toward his family, his pride evident despite their vulnerable circumstances. My son Carlos dreams of becoming a veterinarian. My daughter Elena wants to be a teacher like her grandfather. Rosa's baby will grow up to be whatever his talents and efforts allow. We are not threats to your children's futures. We are people seeking the same things for our families that you want for yours. Miguel's words created visible emotional impact throughout the congregation. Several women dabbed at their eyes, while men who'd voted against sanctuary shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they faced the human reality of their political positions. If federal agents arrest us tomorrow, we will go peacefully, Miguel continued. We will not resist or cause violence that might harm this community. But we will remember the kindness of those who helped us, and we will tell our children that not all strangers are enemies, that some people choose compassion over fear when tested by difficult circumstances. As Miguel sat down, the church fell into contemplative silence. Margaret realized that his dignity and grace under pressure had accomplished something her emotional appeals couldn't. He'd forced everyone present to confront their own character. Rather than arguing about abstract policy positions, Father Santos reclaimed control of the meeting as the evening's designated moderator. Before we conclude tonight's gathering, I want to establish some practical arrangements for what happens next. Regardless of our different opinions about immigration policy, we need to decide how our community will respond to federal law enforcement activities. Mayor Blackwood immediately objected. Father Santos, there's nothing to decide. Federal agents have legal authority that supersedes community preferences. Our obligation is cooperation, not resistance. Our obligation, Father Santos replied firmly, is to ensure that federal agents operate within constitutional limits while respecting the rights of all parties involved. That includes the right of property owners to demand proper warrants and the right of community members to observe law enforcement activities. Margaret understood that Father Santos was establishing legal grounds for organized witness to whatever federal actions occurred. Community members couldn't prevent arrests, but they could document procedures and ensure constitutional protections were respected. Dr. Pierce supported the priest's position. I'll volunteer to serve as medical observer if arrests occur. Federal agents are required to provide appropriate medical care for detainees, especially children and elderly individuals. Margaret felt hope building as community leaders established frameworks for protecting Miguel Santos and his family, even if they couldn't prevent their arrest. Legal oversight and medical monitoring could prevent abuse while ensuring proper treatment during federal custody. I'll document any arrests for legal review, offered James Patterson, a lawyer who'd remained silent throughout the debate. Federal agents sometimes exceed their authority when they believe no one is paying attention to their procedures. Mayor Blackwood grew increasingly agitated as he watched community leaders organizing to limit federal authority rather than support it unconditionally. You're all making serious mistakes. Federal agents don't appreciate interference from local civilians. Regardless of your intentions, Thomas Collins stood again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made his final decision regardless of consequences. Mayor Blackwood, these federal agents are operating in our community, affecting our neighbors, and demanding our cooperation. We have every right to ensure they operate according to law rather than convenience. The mayor's response revealed the depth of his frustration with losing control of community dynamics he'd dominated for years. "Collins, your wife's foolish gestures have created a crisis that threatens everyone in Cedar Ridge. When federal agents start arresting citizens for obstruction of justice, remember that you brought this trouble on our community." Margaret felt anger flaring at Blackwood's personal attack. But before she could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Maria Gonzalez's teenage son stood up, his young face set with determination beyond his years. "Mayor Blackwood, Mrs. Collins didn't create this crisis. She responded to people who needed help. The crisis comes from people who think helping others is dangerous." The young man's words carried special impact because they came from someone who belonged to the next generation, people who would inherit whatever community. Character was established through current choices. "My mother came here 20 years ago because she believed America was a place where hard work and good character mattered more than where you were born," he continued. "If we turn away the Santos family because they're strangers in trouble, we become the kind of place that would have turned away my mother too." Margaret watched faces throughout the congregation as a teenager articulated moral principles that many adults had struggled to express clearly. His generational perspective reminded everyone that community decisions created precedents that would affect children who had no voice in current debates. As the meeting moved toward conclusion, Father Santos called for practical volunteers to organize community response to federal intervention. "We need people willing to serve as legal observers, medical monitors, and witnesses to ensure constitutional procedures are followed." The response surprised even Margaret with its breadth. Nearly 24 hands rose, including several from families who'd voted against sanctuary but were committed to legal oversight of federal actions. The community was revealing capacity for nuanced positions that transcended simple support or opposition. Margaret realized that the evening had accomplished something more complex than she'd expected. Instead of creating unified community support for her position, it had established organized resistance to federal overreach while maintaining respect for legitimate law enforcement authority. "Before we leave tonight," Father Santos announced, "I want to remind everyone that tomorrow will test not just our individual consciences, but our collective character as a community. Whatever happens, we should conduct ourselves with dignity and respect for all parties involved." As families began filing out of the church, Margaret found herself surrounded by supporters offering practical assistance and moral encouragement. Dr. Pierce confirmed his availability for medical observation, while James Patterson provided his card with instructions for contacting him if arrests occurred. But she also noticed the cold stares from Mayor Blackwood's supporters, people who viewed her defiance as dangerous precedent that threatened community stability. The narrow vote had revealed divisions that wouldn't disappear regardless of how federal intervention was resolved. Thomas joined her as they prepared to leave, Miguel Santos and his family walking beside them toward an uncertain future. "Margaret, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that tonight proved something important about both you and this community." "What's that?" she asked, feeling emotionally drained by the evening's intensity. "That courage is contagious. Your willingness to stand up for strangers gave other people permission to find their own moral voices. That's something worth whatever price we pay for it." As they walked home under stars that seemed brighter after the emotional intensity of the church meeting, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by a simple decision to offer shelter during a storm. The frightened mail-order bride who'd arrived in Colorado, territory-seeking security, had become someone willing to risk everything for principles she'd discovered within herself. Tomorrow would bring federal agents with arrest warrants and legal authority that community support couldn't overcome. But tonight had proven that moral courage could inspire others to find their own strength, creating networks of resistance that transcended individual acts of defiance. The final confrontation was approaching, and Margaret Collins was ready to face whatever consequences her choices had created. Dawn on February 22nd arrived with crystalline clarity that made every detail of the landscape visible for miles. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the horizon for signs of approaching riders, while Miguel Santos and his family prepared for what they all understood might be their final morning of freedom. The federal agents had promised to return with proper warrants, and Margaret knew that Thomas's constitutional challenges could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. The sound of multiple horses reached them before the riders became visible. Margaret counted at least 8 mounted figures approaching from the direction of Cedar Ridge, moving with the purposeful formation of a military operation rather than a routine law enforcement visit. Agent Harrison and Agent Walsh rode at the front, followed by additional federal marshals she didn't recognize, Sheriff Tucker and Mayor Blackwood bringing up the rear. "They've brought reinforcements," Thomas observed grimly as he joined Margaret at the window. Whatever resistance they expected from last night's meeting, they're prepared to overwhelm it. But as the federal convoy drew closer, Margaret noticed something that gave her unexpected hope. Additional riders were following at a distance, community members who'd volunteered to serve as witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Dr. Pierce rode alongside Father Santos, while James Patterson carried what appeared to be official documentation in his saddlebags. Behind them came nearly a dozen other citizens, including several who'd opposed sanctuary at the previous night's meeting, but were committed to ensuring constitutional procedures were followed. Agent Harrison dismounted with theatrical authority, unfolding official papers as he approached the cabin. "Mr. and Mrs. Collins, I have federal warrants for the arrest of 9 individuals currently residing on your property. You are legally obligated to provide access and cooperation." Thomas stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the federal agents and his front door. "Agent Harrison, I'll need to examine those warrants to verify their legitimacy and scope before granting access to my property." The demand clearly irritated Harrison, who was accustomed to frontier residents showing automatic deference to federal authority. "Sir, you are not qualified to evaluate federal documentation. Your obligation is compliance, not legal review." James Patterson dismounted and approached with professional composure. "Agent Harrison, I'm an attorney licensed to practice in Colorado Territory. Mr. Collins has the right to legal representation during this process." The presence of organized legal opposition caught the federal agents off guard. They'd expected to execute simple arrests in a remote location with minimal oversight, not face coordinated resistance from educated citizens who understood constitutional protections. "Mr. Patterson," Agent Walsh intervened, "these are federal immigration warrants. Local legal representation is not relevant to their execution. All federal actions are subject to constitutional oversight," Patterson replied firmly. "The Fourth Amendment applies to immigration enforcement just as it does to any other law enforcement activity." Margaret watched the legal maneuvering with fascination and terror. The attorneys were fighting over procedural technicalities while 9 people's lives hung in the balance, their fate determined by interpretations of documents and constitutional provisions they couldn't fully understand. Dr. Pierce approached Agent Harrison with medical authority that commanded respect even from federal officials. "Agent, I need to inform you that several of the individuals you're planning to arrest require ongoing medical attention. Federal regulations require appropriate medical care for detainees, especially children and elderly individuals." The doctor's intervention introduced complications the agents hadn't anticipated. They were prepared to make arrests, but not to assume medical responsibility for people with health conditions that could worsen during transportation and detention. "What kind of medical conditions?" Agent Walsh asked reluctantly. "Pneumonia symptoms in the elderly man, potential frostbite complications in 3 of the children, and a nursing infant who requires specialized care," Dr. Pierce replied with professional precision. "Federal detention facilities may not be equipped to provide appropriate treatment." Margaret realized that Dr. Pierce was using medical concerns to create administrative obstacles that could delay or complicate the arrests. Federal agents might have legal authority to take custody of the immigrants, but they also had legal obligations to ensure proper care once they assumed responsibility. Father Santos stepped forward with religious authority that carried weight even with secular officials. Agents, I want to ensure that family members aren't separated during this process. Federal regulations protect family unity, especially when minor children are involved. The priest's intervention raised additional procedural questions about how the arrests would be conducted. Miguel Santos and his group included 3 separate families, with children ranging from infants to teenagers. Keeping families together during transportation and detention would require coordination that simple arrest procedures didn't. Address Agent Harrison's frustration was becoming evident as what should have been a straightforward operation became complicated by organized community oversight. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your concerns, but federal law enforcement doesn't require community approval or supervision. Sheriff Tucker finally spoke, his position as local law enforcement giving him unique authority in the situation. Agent Harrison, while I'm obligated to support federal operations, I'm also responsible for ensuring that law enforcement activities in my jurisdiction follow proper procedures. Tucker's statement was carefully neutral, but it established his right to observe and potentially limit federal actions that exceeded legal authority or violated constitutional protections. Margaret understood that the sheriff was walking a delicate line between federal cooperation and community accountability. Miguel Santos emerged from the cabin with quiet dignity, followed by his family and the other immigrants. They dressed in their best clothes and arranged themselves with the composed bearing of people prepared to face their fate with honor intact. "Agent Harrison," Miguel said respectfully, "we are ready to comply with your orders. We ask only that our families be kept together and that the children receive appropriate care during whatever process follows." His cooperation and dignity in the face of arrest clearly affected several of the community witnesses. Margaret could see emotional reactions among people who'd opposed sanctuary, but were now confronting the human reality of federal immigration enforcement. Agent Harrison began reading arrest charges and legal notices with bureaucratic efficiency, but his words were interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected rider approaching at considerable speed. Margaret recognized the newcomer as Samuel Hendricks. The elderly veteran Thomas had been helping when the blizzard struck. Hendricks dismounted with surprising agility for his age and approached Agent Harrison with the authoritative bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Agent, I understand you're here to arrest the people who saved my family's lives." The statement caught everyone off guard. Margaret had no idea what connection existed between Samuel Hendricks and the immigrants facing arrest, but his intervention was clearly significant. "During the blizzard, my wife became seriously ill with pneumonia," Hendricks continued. "Thomas Collins was helping us, but the storm was too severe for him to return home safely. These Mexican folks," he gestured toward Miguel Santos and his family, "left the shelter of the Collins cabin and traveled through the killer storm to bring medical supplies to my wife." Margaret stared in shock. This was the first she'd heard of any connection between their guests and the Hendricks family emergency. "They risked their lives to help strangers," Hendricks said, his voice carrying the emotional weight of personal gratitude. "My Eleanor would have died without the medicine they brought through conditions that would have killed most men." Agent Walsh stepped forward skeptically. "Sir, how do you know these are the same individuals?" Samuel Hendricks pulled a letter from his coat pocket. "Because Miguel Santos left this note in Spanish and English, explaining who they were and why they were helping. My granddaughter translated it for us." He handed the letter to Agent Harrison, who read it with growing discomfort as the narrative of dangerous criminals was replaced by documentation of life-saving heroism. Dr. Pierce moved to support Hendricks's testimony. "I can confirm that Mrs. Hendricks recovered from pneumonia that could have been fatal without timely medical intervention. If these individuals provided life-saving assistance during the storm, that constitutes extraordinary community service. Father Santos seized on the revelation to frame the situation in moral terms. Agent Harrison, you're planning to arrest people who risk their own lives to save the life of an American citizen. Does federal immigration policy really require punishing heroes? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the federal agents represented. They'd arrived expecting to execute routine arrests of immigration violators, but community testimony was revealing acts of courage and selflessness that complicated simple narratives about law and order. Mayor Blackwood, sensing the situation slipping away from his preferred outcome, stepped forward aggressively. Agent Harrison, these emotional appeals don't change the legal facts. These people are in violation of federal immigration law, regardless of any alleged heroic actions. But Samuel Hendricks wasn't finished. Mayor Blackwood, my family has lived in Colorado territory for 15 years. I fought for this country in the Civil War and lost 2 sons in service to the Union. When I tell you that these people are heroes who saved my wife's life, I expect that testimony to carry some weight in how they're treated. The veteran's military service and community standing gave his words enormous authority with everyone present, including federal agents who couldn't dismiss such testimony without appearing callous or unpatriotic. Agent Harrison found himself facing a situation that his training hadn't prepared him for. Simple immigration arrests had become complicated by community organization, legal oversight, medical concerns, and now testimony about life-saving heroism that directly contradicted assumptions about the character of people he was supposed to arrest. Margaret watched the federal agents struggle with competing pressures and realized that community resistance had achieved something she hadn't expected. They couldn't prevent the arrests, but they'd forced federal authorities to confront the human consequences of immigration enforcement in ways that bureaucratic procedures normally avoided. Agent Harrison, James Patterson said formally, given the testimony about life-saving actions during a natural disaster, I request that you consider alternative enforcement options. Federal regulations provide discretionary authority for immigration officials to consider extraordinary circumstances. The legal challenge introduced possibilities Margaret hadn't known existed. Federal agents had discretionary authority that could allow them to delay arrests or modify enforcement actions when special circumstances warranted consideration. Thomas stepped forward to support the attorney's request. Agent Harrison, these people aren't flight risks or threats to community safety. They've proven their character through their actions. Surely federal immigration policy includes provisions for people who've demonstrated exceptional service to American citizens. The federal agent studied the faces surrounding him, community, members who'd organized to ensure constitutional protections, legal and medical professionals providing oversight, veterans testifying to heroic actions, and religious authority challenging the moral foundations of his mission. Agent Harrison made his decision with visible reluctance. Given the extraordinary circumstances that have been brought to my attention, I'm going to exercise discretionary authority to delay these arrests pending review by my superiors. Margaret felt her knees nearly buckle with relief as the immediate threat of arrest was lifted. But she understood that the reprieve was temporary, not permanent. Federal authorities would review the situation and likely return with different tactics or additional legal authority. However, Agent Harrison continued, these individuals remain subject to federal immigration oversight. They cannot leave this immediate area without permission, and they must report to federal authorities within 1 week to begin regularizing their status. The conditions were restrictive, but they provided time for legal advocacy and community support that could lead to more permanent solutions. Margaret realized that organized community resistance had achieved something remarkable, not prevention of federal enforcement, but forcing that enforcement to consider human circumstances that bureaucratic procedures normally ignored. As the federal agents prepared to leave, Miguel Santos approached Agent Harrison with dignity and tact, despite everything he'd endured. "Agent, thank you for considering the testimony about our actions. We will comply with all reporting requirements and work to resolve our status through proper legal channels." His grace under pressure impressed everyone present, including federal agents who'd arrived expecting to deal with criminals rather than people whose character commanded respect, even from their adversaries. Margaret understood that the morning's confrontation had accomplished something more significant than temporary reprieve from arrest. It had demonstrated that organized community action could influence federal authority when that action was grounded in constitutional principles, moral conviction, and documented evidence of good character. The battle wasn't over, but neither was it lost. And Margaret Collins had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding confrontation, but from facing it with courage, preparation, and the support of people who believe that doing right matters more than avoiding risk. 6 months after the federal agents had ridden away from the Collins homestead, Margaret stood in the Cedar Ridge courthouse, witnessing something she'd never imagined possible. Miguel Santos raised his right hand as Judge William Morrison administered the oath of citizenship to him and his family, their faces glowing with pride and determination, as they became Americans through legal process rather than bureaucratic persecution. The transformation had begun with James Patterson's legal advocacy and Dr. Pierce's medical documentation, but it had succeeded because of sustained community support that refused to let federal authorities ignore the human dimension of immigration policy. Letters from dozens of Cedar Ridge residents, testimony about life-saving actions during the blizzard, and documented evidence of economic contributions had created an overwhelming case for discretionary relief. "Congratulations, Mr. Santos," Judge Morrison said warmly as he completed the ceremony. "You and your family have earned citizenship through service to this community in ways that honor the best traditions of American immigration." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Carlos Santos, now 16 and fluent in English, accept his citizenship certificate with the kind of joy that made her remember why she'd been willing to risk everything for strangers seeking safety. The young man who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian would now have the opportunity to pursue that dream without fear of deportation or legal uncertainty. Rosa Martinez, whose infant son had nearly died from exposure during that terrible blizzard, held her now walking toddler as she accepted her own citizenship papers. The child who'd been blue with cold in Margaret's cabin was now a healthy, curious boy whose first words had been a mixture of Spanish and English that reflected his bicultural heritage. Thomas squeezed Margaret's hand as they watched the ceremony conclude. "You did this," he whispered. "Your choice to open our door that night started everything that led to this moment." Margaret shook her head gently. "We did this. The whole community did this. I just made the first choice. Everyone else made the choices that turned it into something meaningful, the path from that desperate night. During the blizzard to this celebration of new citizenship had been neither straight nor simple. Federal authorities had initially resisted community pressure for discretionary relief, requiring months of legal advocacy and political pressure before agreeing to expedited citizenship procedures for people who demonstrated extraordinary service during natural disasters. Dr. Pierce had played a crucial role by documenting the medical aspects of the immigrants' life-saving actions during the storm. His detailed report about Rosa's herbal medicine knowledge and Miguel's emergency medical assistance had been forwarded to territorial health authorities, who'd issued formal commendations for civilian heroism during natural disasters. Father Santos had provided spiritual and legal support by researching precedents for sanctuary and discretionary immigration, relief based on humanitarian service. His correspondence with church authorities had generated additional political pressure for humane treatment of immigrants who'd risked their lives to help American citizens. But perhaps most importantly, the community itself had sustained support for the Santos family and their companions through months of legal uncertainty. Families who'd initially opposed the sanctuary had been transformed by witnessing the character and contributions of people they'd feared as abstract threats to community stability. The Miller Ranch had eventually hired the entire group for permanent positions after their legal status was resolved. But their integration into Cedar Ridge society had extended far beyond employment. Miguel Santos had been elected to the school board after his educational background became known, while Rosa's medical knowledge had made her an informal consultant for families dealing with health challenges that required herbal remedies. Mayor Eugene Blackwood had never publicly acknowledged his error in opposing sanctuary, but his political influence had waned considerably as community members demonstrated preference for leaders who prioritized human welfare over abstract policy positions. The mayoral election scheduled for next month was expected to result in significant changes to local government. Leadership. Sheriff Tucker had been re-elected unanimously after his careful balance between federal, corporation and constitutional oversight had earned respect from residents across political divides. His measured response to the immigration crisis had demonstrated that law enforcement could serve both legal requirements and community values when guided by principled leadership. Margaret's own transformation had been as dramatic as anything experienced by the people she'd helped. The timid mail-order bride who'd feared making waves in her new community had become a recognized advocate for immigrant rights and humanitarian policy throughout Colorado Territory. Her correspondence with territorial legislators had influenced passage of laws protecting people who provided emergency shelter during natural disasters. She'd also discovered talents and interests she'd never known she possessed. Working with James Patterson on immigration law had revealed aptitude for legal research and advocacy that had led to informal partnership in cases involving immigrant families throughout the region. Her writing skills, developed through years of correspondence with Thomas before their marriage, had proven valuable for documenting cases and preparing legal arguments. "Margaret," a familiar voice called from across the courthouse lobby. She turned to see Agent Harrison approaching with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal discomfort. The federal agent who'd arrived 6 months earlier, prepared to make arrests, had requested permission to attend the citizenship ceremony as an observer. "Agent Harrison," Margaret replied with cautious politeness. "I didn't expect to see you here today, Mrs. Collins. I wanted to apologize for the way I handled the situation at your homestead. I was focused on enforcing regulations without considering the human circumstances that should influence how those regulations are applied." His admission surprised Margaret with its directness and apparent sincerity. Federal agents rarely acknowledged errors in judgment, especially to civilians who challenged their authority. "Agent Harrison, you were doing your job according to the training and instructions you'd received. The fault wasn't with your enforcement. It was with policies that didn't account for situations like the one we faced." Thomas joined their conversation, extending his hand to the federal agent with the courtesy that characterized all his interactions, even with former adversaries. "Agent Harrison, we appreciate your willingness to reconsider the situation and support the legal process that led to today's ceremony." The federal agent shook Thomas's hand gratefully. "Mr. Collins, your community taught me something important about the difference between following rules and serving justice. I've requested transfer to immigration policy development specifically because of what I learned from this case." Margaret understood that Agent Harrison's career change represented broader recognition within federal immigration services that enforcement without consideration of humanitarian circumstances often violated American values more than immigration regulations. The Santos case had become a precedent for discretionary relief based on community service and character demonstration. Miguel Santos approached their group as the courthouse began emptying of ceremony attendees. His dignity had been enhanced rather than diminished by months of legal uncertainty, and his gratitude remained as profound as it had been during that first desperate night seeking shelter. "Mrs. Collins, Mr. Collins, Agent Harrison," he said with formal courtesy. "I wanted to thank all of you for the different roles you played in bringing my family to this day. Mrs. Collins for opening her door when we were dying, Mr. Collins for supporting that choice despite the risks, and Agent Harrison for exercising discretion when regulations might have demanded otherwise." His words highlighted the complexity of the moral and legal issues they'd all navigated. Simple narratives about heroes and villains couldn't capture the reality of situations where well-intentioned people faced conflicting obligations and unclear guidance about how to balance competing values. Dr. Pierce joined the gathering as they prepared to leave the courthouse. "Miguel, I have some news that might interest you. The Territorial Medical Board has agreed to recognize your educational credentials from Mexico. With some additional training, you could qualify for teaching positions in our territorial school system." The possibility of returning to education, Miguel's original profession, brought visible emotion to the man who'd been forced into agricultural labor by economic necessity rather than choice. His expertise in languages and literature had been valuable throughout his integration into Cedar Ridge society, but formal recognition of his qualifications would allow him to contribute at the level his education warranted. "Dr. Pierce, that is more than I dared hope for when we knocked on Mrs. Collins's door during the storm," Miguel replied. "My grandfather always said that education was the one possession that could never be taken away. But I had begun to doubt whether that was true in America." Father Santos appeared at Margaret's elbow as the group conversation continued. "Margaret, I wanted you to know that the church hierarchy has formally recognized your actions as an example of lived Christian faith that other parishes should emulate. Your willingness to risk personal security for the welfare of strangers has been cited in pastoral letters throughout the territory." The religious recognition was meaningful to Margaret, who'd struggled with questions about how her faith should influence her response to human suffering. The blizzard crisis had forced her to choose between safety and service, teaching her that authentic religious conviction required action rather than just belief. "Father Santos, I never thought of what I did as particularly religious. I just couldn't let people freeze to death outside my door." "Margaret, that's exactly what makes your actions authentically Christian. You responded to human need without calculating the cost to yourself or the theological implications of your choice. That's the kind of faith that transforms communities." As the group began dispersing to various celebration gatherings planned throughout Cedar Ridge, Margaret reflected on how completely her understanding of courage and community had evolved since that terrifying night when she'd first heard voices calling through the blizzard. The frightened woman who'd begged Thomas not to touch her during their first encounter had become someone willing to touch entire communities through advocacy and service. The mail-order bride seeking security through marriage had discovered the true security came from building relationships based on mutual support and shared values rather than simple self-protection. Thomas drove their wagons slowly through Cedar Ridge's main street, allowing them to observe the changes that 6 months of community transformation had created. New businesses had opened to serve the growing population of immigrant families who'd followed the Santos Group's example in seeking opportunities in Colorado Territory. The town that had once feared strangers now actively recruited diverse families whose skills and perspectives were strengthening the local economy. "Margaret," Thomas said, as they passed the church where the crucial community meeting had taken place, "do you ever regret the choice you made that night? All the conflict and uncertainty it created?" Margaret considered the question as she watched children playing in the street, some speaking Spanish, some English, some switching between languages with the fluid bilingualism that represented America's immigrant heritage at its best. Thomas, I regret the pain and fear that people experienced because of the conflict. I regret that some community members felt threatened by changes they didn't understand. But I don't regret helping people who needed help. And I don't regret learning what I was capable of when tested by impossible circumstances. She paused, watching Miguel Santos's son, Carlos, help elderly Mrs. Henderson carry groceries to her wagon. The young man who'd arrived half-frozen and speaking minimal English was now fully integrated into community life while maintaining pride in his cultural heritage. Besides, Margaret continued, look what that choice led to. 9 people became American citizens today. Dozens of families have found new opportunities in our community. Federal immigration policy has been influenced by evidence that humanitarian considerations can coexist with legal requirements. And our community discovered that diversity strengthens rather than threatens what we've built together. Thomas nodded with satisfaction. Margaret, when I advertised for a mail-order bride, I thought I was looking for someone who could help me manage a ranch. I never imagined I'd find someone who would help me understand what it means to be truly American. As they reached their homestead, Margaret could see smoke rising from the chimney that had served as a beacon of hope for desperate travelers during the worst storm any of them could remember. The guest cabin, where the Santos family had recovered from their brush with death, now housed a young teacher who'd come west to establish schools for immigrant children. Throughout the territory, the cycle of hospitality and mutual support that had begun with one woman's choice to open her door during a blizzard had become a permanent feature of community identity. Cedar Ridge had become known throughout Colorado Territory as a place where strangers were welcomed, where diverse families could find opportunities, and where American ideals of equality and opportunity were practiced rather than just proclaimed. Margaret Collins, the mail-order bride who'd arrived in Colorado Territory, seeking nothing more than security and companionship, had discovered that true fulfillment came from using whatever courage and compassion she possessed in service of others facing similar challenges. To those she'd once faced herself, the woman who'd once begged a stranger not to touch her had learned to reach out and touch entire communities, creating ripples of positive change that would extend far beyond her own lifetime. Sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the simplest choices, like opening a door to strangers seeking shelter from the storm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.